Hello everyone. Today we continue with our discussion on the US-China Cold War, focusing on the political and diplomatic issues between the two nations. We begin with the current suppression of democratic freedoms in Hong Kong, which is a semi-autonomous territory under China. Hong Kong, a former British colony, was handed over to China by Britain in 1984 under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which gave Hong Kong special status and unique freedom not seen in the mainland China, under the principle of one country, two systems. But the national security law of Hong Kong imposed by China on 30th June 2020 is allegedly a threat to the Hong Kong's autonomy. As we had discussed in our earlier video on the law, the statements of the law are not only vague, but it attempts to impose the political and legal system of China into Hong Kong, curtailing the citizens' freedom of speech, expression, and right to protest against the government policies similar to the mainland, including the censorship of information by the government. Amidst the globally widespread response against China, President Trump of US described the Chinese government's move to introduce the law in Hong Kong as a tragedy. He said China has smothered Hong Kong's freedom, accused China of violating its obligations under the 1984 agreement, replacing one country, two systems with one country, one system. Trump said he no longer considered Hong Kong to be separate from China. Currently, Hong Kong, a major global financial center, enjoys a special status with US compared to mainland China. It is treated as a separate customs and travel territory and so is not subject to trade tariffs applied by US on the mainland. Trump has however announced that he will start to end this preferential treatment for Hong Kong in trade and travel. Trump also said sanctions would be imposed on Chinese and Hong Kong officials who were believed by US to be involved in eroding the territory's autonomy. The State Department would also revise its travel advisory to US citizens for Hong Kong in light of increased danger of surveillance from China. China has however told the West to stop interfering in Hong Kong. The Global Times newspaper, run by China's ruling Communist Party, called the move towards revoking Hong Kong's special status with US recklessly arbitrary and warned that Beijing will probably match some of US sanctions and restrictions in a tit-for-tat manner. The next reason for the current clash between US and China is the repression of Uighur Muslims in Xinjiang province of China. According to experts and government officials, some 800,000 to 2 million Uyghurs and other Muslims, including ethnic Kazakhs and Uzbeks, have been detained in internment camps since April 2017 in Xinjiang, a northwestern province of China. Outside of the camps, 11 million Uyghurs living in the province have continued to suffer from a decades-long crackdown by Chinese authorities on their religious freedom and basic human rights and are put under continuous intrusive electronic surveillance. Further, there are recent shocking revelations of a possible cultural genocide of Uyghurs by birth control measures in Xinjiang by the Chinese government aiming at ethno-racial supremacy of Han Chinese, a campaign that meets at least one of the 5 criteria for physical genocide specified by the UN. The global response to these human rights abuses has been immense. In October 2019, US imposed visa restrictions on Chinese officials believed to be responsible for or complicit in the detention of Muslims in Xinjiang. It also blacklisted more than 24 Chinese companies and agencies linked to the abuses in the region, including surveillance technology manufacturers and Xinjiang's Public Security Bureau, effectively blocking them from buying US products. In June 2020, President Trump signed a legislation passed with overwhelming support from Congress, mandating that individuals including Communist Party Secretary of China, Zheng Changkuo, face sanctions for oppressing Uyghurs. This is the first time such sanctions have been imposed on a member of China's Politburo. The law also requires that US businesses and individuals selling products to or operating in Xinjiang ensure their activities don't contribute to human rights violations, including the use of forced labor. The US State Department has accused Chinese officials of subjecting Muslims to torture, abuse, and trying to basically erase their culture and their religion. Trump, however, did not hold a ceremony to mark his signing of the legislation, which came to light as newspapers published excerpts from the new book by former National Security Advisor John Bolton. Among other allegations, Bolton says that Trump had sought Chinese President Xi Jinping's help to win re-election during a closed-door 2019 meeting, and that Trump had actually encouraged Xi to go ahead with building the camps in Xinjiang. The White House, however, did not respond to this allegation. Whatsoever, one of the main exile groups, the World Uighur Congress, thanked Trump for signing the law, adding that it gave hope to the desperate Uighur people. Chinese officials, however, publicly maintain that the camps have only two purposes: to teach Mandarin, Chinese laws and vocational skills, and to prevent citizens from becoming influenced by extremist ideas so as to nip the terrorist activities in the bud. The Chinese government has resisted international pressure to allow in outside investigators, saying anything happening inside Xinjiang is an internal issue of China. It denies that people are forced to denounce Islam, are detained against their will, and experience abuse in the internment camps of Xinjiang. China responded to the signing of the law by Trump with anger, saying it vilified the human rights situation in Xinjiang and was a malicious attack against China. China's foreign ministry said in a statement, "We again urge US side to immediately correct its mistake and stop using this Xinjiang-related law to harm China's interests and interfere in China's internal affairs. Otherwise, China will resolutely take countermeasures and all the consequences arising therefrom must be fully borne by the US." To further aggravate the issue, the Trump administration is now considering a sweeping ban on travel to the US by members of the Chinese Communist Party and their families, by members of the People's Liberation Army and executives at state-owned enterprises, a move that would certainly prompt retaliation against Americans seeking to enter or remain in China and exacerbate the tensions between the two nations. The presidential proclamation, still in draft form, could also authorize US government to revoke the visas of party members and their families who are already in the country, leading to their expulsion. It would be based on the same statute in the Immigration and Nationality Act used in a 2017 travel ban on several predominantly Muslim countries. A broad ban would give the state government new powers to block top Chinese political and business leaders and their families from entering US. It would also allow the department to formalize a process by which American officials could inquire about the party's status during visa application interviews and on forms. Further, the State Department in July renewed a travel warning to its citizens traveling to China, saying the Chinese authorities are engaged in arbitrary enforcement of local laws for purposes other than maintaining law and order, which could include detention and the use of exit bans. Jude Blanchard, a China scholar at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, opined that the overwhelming majority of Chinese Communist Party members have no involvement or input into Beijing's policy making. So going after the entire party membership is like China sanctioning all Republicans because of frustrations with Trump. Hence, such a move would only inflame public opinion in China against US, since this would target nearly 10% of the entire Chinese population. Coming to the next major reason for the fallout between US and China is the widening battle over technology. China has long been accused by successive US administrations of stealing American technology. The Trump White House has further escalated the accusations by seeking an international blacklisting of Huawei, China's largest technology company, calling it a front for China's efforts to infiltrate the telecommunications infrastructure of other nations for strategic advantage. In the month of July, Britain too declared it was siding with the US in barring Huawei products from its high-speed wireless network. Thus, the already strained relations in the tech front have been stoked into a tech war. Huawei is a giant telecom supplier and manufacturer, but for more than a year, there has been no shortage of scrutiny on the Chinese telecom giant, and a number of countries have banned the use of its networking equipment. Its phones are virtually invisible in US despite its massive presence around the world. The company's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, has been detained in Canada since December 2018 on an extradition warrant to the US on charges of violating American sanctions against Iran. In May 2020, a Canadian court ruled that fraud charges in the US against Huawei's chief financial officer would also constitute a crime in Canada. And US under Trump since 2018 has imposed a series of restrictions on Huawei and has tried to persuade other countries too to bar the company from involvement in their 5G telecommunications infrastructure. The Trump administration says Huawei is a national security threat because it could access sensitive information and turn it over to the Chinese government. Hence, in May 2019, US issued an executive order banning companies from working with or buying Huawei networking equipment and added Huawei to the US Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security entity list, effectively banning the company from US communications networks. A year later, Trump administration designated the company as backed by Chinese military for sure and extended the order until 2021. The ban is centered on any technology related to the 5G technology. Further, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo alleged that some employees of Huawei provide material support to regimes engaging in human rights abuses globally, hinting at the repression of Uighur Muslims in Xinjiang by the Chinese government. And in July 2020, Trump administration imposed Huawei workers with US visa restrictions. The US has, however, offered a reprieve to companies, allowing them to work with Huawei through temporary licenses, but the Commerce Department has also accused the company of exploiting the rules to continue using American technology in its semiconductor design. However, Huawei CEO Ren Zhengfei said that the company does not pose a national security risk to the US as its products aren't used in US 5G networks. He thinks Trump is only using Huawei to put pressure on the Chinese government when the company is actually trying to separate itself from the trade talks between the two nations and is refraining from taking help from the Chinese government. Zhengfei stated that Huawei is ready for any future US bans since it has reduced its dependence on US companies for core products and has also cut the production of non-core products that depend on US components. This way, the company will continue to do business even if US companies stop shipments again in the future. Further, he criticizes new US rules as pernicious and arbitrary and warns that US ban will significantly harm American jobs and companies like Qualcomm and Micron will lose out an important customer. Moreover, a quiet panic is already spreading in America over a law taking effect in 2 months that requires American companies to certify that their entire global supply chain is devoid of products from 5 Chinese companies including Huawei. The trade groups say that the companies still reeling from the economic effects of the coronavirus pandemic should get more time. As far as the relations between US and China are concerned, the US ban on Huawei is the most heated topic currently in US-China trade negotiations. China agreed to return to the negotiation table on the condition that US lift the Huawei ban. While the US hasn't yet lifted the ban, it has agreed to restart trade for components not critical to national security of US. In retaliation, China reportedly considers action against Nokia and Ericsson if European Union too bans Huawei. And thus, the relations between US and China seem to be worsening more. The most recent diplomatic sparring between US and China is that Trump administration has told China's diplomats in Houston to leave the country, accusing Chinese citizens of stealing scientific research. Mr. Pompeo said, the Chinese Communist Party was stealing not just the American but also the European intellectual property, costing hundreds of thousands of jobs. We are setting out clear expectations for how the Chinese Communist Party is going to behave, and when they don't, we are going to take actions that protect the American people, protect our security, our national security, and also protect our economy and jobs. It was unclear what had immediately prompted the crackdown on the consulate, although the State Department said China was directing massive illegal spying and influence operations. It was interfering in domestic politics as well as having coerced the business leaders and threatened families of Chinese Americans residing in China. It has been reported without evidence that the Houston consulate was the epicenter of research theft by China in the US, which had accelerated over the last 6 months and could be related to efforts to develop a vaccine for the coronavirus. The Houston consulate is also alleged to have had a history of engaging in subversive behavior, like the Consul General Sai Wai, the top Chinese official there, and 2 other diplomats were caught using false identification to escort Chinese travelers on May 31st to the gate area of a charter flight from George Bush Intercontinental Airport. Further, a 7-page document compiled by American law enforcement officials broadly outlines several FBI investigations linked to the Houston consulate. Those included attempts to illegally transfer medical research and other sensitive information from the institutions in the area, talent recruitment plans to persuade more than 50 researchers, professors and academics in the area to turn over tightly held research or information to Chinese institutions, and the coercion of Chinese citizens in the US whom the Chinese government has deemed as wanted fugitives to return to their homeland. The US Department of Justice further accused China of sponsoring hackers who had been targeting labs developing COVID-19 vaccines. 2 Chinese nationals who allegedly spied on US research companies and got help from state agents for other thefts have been charged. Mr. Trump has also warned that it's always possible his administration would close more Chinese missions in US. Hours after the administration issued its order, the Houston consulate employees burned papers in open metal barrels in the courtyard of the building, prompting police officers and firefighters to rush to the area. The Chinese embassy in Washington said in a statement, the US accusations are groundless fabrications. Further, in Beijing, a spokesman for China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Wang Wenbin, called the move illegal under international law and described it as the latest in a series of aggressions and urged US to immediately reverse the decision, which he alleged to be politically motivated, and warned that China would certainly make legitimate and necessary reactions, suggesting that China would at a minimum close an American consulate in China. Meanwhile, China's consulate in San Francisco has also come under scrutiny after the FBI alleged that a Chinese researcher accused of visa fraud for hiding her affiliation with the Chinese military had taken refuge there and executed a search warrant to seize her electronic devices. Though the Chinese researcher claimed that she had not served in the Chinese military when trying to obtain a US visa, an open source investigation uncovered photos of the University of California researcher wearing military uniform, and a search of her home found further evidence of her affiliation with the People's Liberation Army of China, and thus Chinese diplomats across the US have been alleged to have helped military officers hide their identities. Whatsoever it may be, in a series of tweets, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman of China, Hua Chunying, described the reasons given by the US for closing the consulate as unbelievably ridiculous. According to her, while Chinese diplomats are promoting mutual understanding and friendship, the US Embassy in China publicly attacks China's political system. As a result of smears and hatred fanned up by the US government, the Chinese embassy has received bomb and death threats. She further urged US to reverse its erroneous decision, or China would react with firm countermeasures. The Foreign Ministry of China also posted a warning to Chinese students in the US, asking them to be on guard as US law enforcement agencies have stepped up arbitrary interrogations, harassment, confiscation of personal belongings, and detention targeting Chinese international students in the US. According to experts in US, in the midst of a presidential re-election campaign, and with the US economy and society battered by the COVID-19 pandemic, Trump has determined that there is political advantage in playing the China card. Trump's campaign strategists, anxious about his failures on the pandemic, are pushing a comprehensive anti-China message in an appeal to Mr. Trump's supporters. Hence, experts warn of a spiraling tit-for-tat battle driven in part by US domestic considerations, which can only make the complex and developing tensions between US and China even worse. According to analysts, China has been the biggest beneficiary of globalization, and it has used Western-led multilateral institutions to advance its interests and influence. At the same time, US has actually retreated from its multilateral responsibilities under the leadership of Trump. Far from opening up a new battleground, China's plan is to fight on a familiar territory. Its message to the world seems to be simple. China is ready to pick up the slack as US retreats from its global responsibilities. And for a world exhausted and impoverished by the pandemic, it is a seductive proposition. Anybody who takes the reins will be good enough. Development and stability are the priorities of most countries, and they are not worried about China's ambitions to lead. The old Cold War was a very fierce confrontation and competition between two great powers, US and Russia, driven by ideology and strategy. In the case of US and China, the two powers are selectively but rapidly decoupling from each other. Using this definition, it can be said that China and US have begun to enter a new Cold War. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who is taking stern warnings about Beijing around the world, did not reject the Cold War comparison in a recent radio interview. On the positive side, we have extensive engagement between the two countries, and China has plenty of options to alleviate the US concerns, such as pulling back weapon systems in the South China Sea. But it is widely understood that China won't do this because it fundamentally misunderstands the drivers of US policy. It thinks US is frustrated with its own decline in power and is trying to curb the rise of China as a global power. And these misunderstandings between the two nations could lead the entire globe into a war. And that's all for today. Thank you.